The morning light slipped through a small gap in Zara Washington's curtain, casting soft stripes across her bedroom wall. She woke with a start, her heart skipping a beat as she remembered the date. Today was the interview. She had worked years for this opportunity, countless hours building her resume, networking, strategizing her way up. And now everything hinged on this one meeting. She lay still for a moment, gathering herself, then took a slow breath and swung her legs over the edge of the bed, planting her bare feet firmly on the cool, warm floorboards of her modest apartment. The city outside was already alive, with car horns blaring and hurried footsteps echoing off the concrete. She let the sounds ground her, finding a strange comfort in the ordinary hum of life. The apartment was small but organized to a T, every corner optimized to make the most of her limited space. Above her desk was a framed photo of her parents on their wedding day, their faces alight with hope and joy. Zara studied their expressions for a moment, feeling the swell of gratitude. They had worked tirelessly so she could have choices they hadn't, and today was proof she was making the most of those sacrifices. She ran through her mental checklist, resumed copies in her sleek leather portfolio, crisp blazer laid out, shoes polished. Zara dressed with deliberate precision, buttoning her blouse and adjusting her blazer in the mirror. She took a moment to practice a few answers she had rehearsed 100 times. Her accomplishments, her goals, why she wanted to be part of Whitfield and Brooks, the top investment firm in the city. Her voice was steady, but she could hear the slight tremor in it, an unspoken anxiety that lingered at the edges. After a final check of her bag, she locked up and stepped into the hallway, the faint aroma of Mrs. Gomez's breakfast burritos drifting in from next door. She passed the familiar sights and sounds of her building, the faded linoleum floors, the crack in the stairwell wall from last winter's freeze, the cheerful barking of Mr. Lee's Pomeranian downstairs. All of it felt grounding, like pieces of a world she belonged to even as she set her sights on bigger goals. As she stepped out into the brisk morning air, Zara felt the comforting weight of the city's energy surround her. There was a quiet determination in her stride as she navigated the bustling sidewalks, her eyes focused forward. She couldn't afford to let self-doubt creep in today. She was ready, and she knew she could be the asset Whitfield and Brooks was looking for. At least, that's what she told herself, even as the familiar voice of imposter syndrome whispered faintly in the background. The firm's office tower loomed ahead, glass reflecting the early sunlight like a monolith of power and wealth. Zara couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with trepidation as she stepped inside, feeling the subtle shift in atmosphere from the lively streets to the pristine, quiet grandeur of the lobby. Every surface gleamed, every corner was sharp and intentional, as if the very space itself commanded respect. She took a deep breath, reminded herself of the hard work it took to get here, and approached the front desk. "Good morning. Welcome to Whitfield and Brooks. How can I help you?" The receptionist, a polished woman with a warm smile, looked up, and Zara felt a touch of ease settle over her. "Hi, I'm Zara Washington. I have an interview with Mr. Lansing at 10. The receptionist typed a few notes, then nodded. "Of course, Ms. Washington. You're right on time. Please take a seat, and someone will be with you shortly." Zara thanked her and walked to the waiting area, her eyes sweeping over the room. Everything was impeccable, from the polished marble floors to the abstract art on the walls. But her gaze landed on one detail that was incongruous with the rest. A portrait hung in a shadowed corner near the entrance to the main office area. It was a faded, sepia-toned photograph, worn but carefully preserved. The woman in the image was striking, her gaze direct and unyielding. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested the early 20th century, with a high-collared blouse and a simple string of pearls. Zara noticed that she was black, her expression solemn, yet there was an unmistakable pride in her posture. Unlike the other, more contemporary art around the office, this photograph looked out of place, almost like a piece of history frozen in time. A strange feeling swept over Zara as she studied the woman's face. There was something familiar in her expression, a quiet determination that felt like a mirror of her own. Zara's thoughts were interrupted by a low murmur nearby, and she noticed a couple of employees passing by, casting glances in her direction. She straightened her posture, aware of their looks, but kept her eyes focused on the photograph, unable to shake the curiosity bubbling within her. Zara Washington's story begins long before she was born, in the dreams and sacrifices of generations before her. She grew up in the heart of a family whose history, though largely undocumented, was rich with tales of resilience, entrepreneurship, and relentless grit. Her father, Marlon, was the family historian, always filling the gaps left by history books with vivid anecdotes, telling Zara and her brother about ancestors who'd fought for freedom and dignity in a world that often denied them both. Marlon's pride in their lineage ran deep, and he took every opportunity to remind Zara of the legacy she carried within her. "People like us have always had to make our own way, Zara," he would tell her on quiet Sunday mornings, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "We've had to be our own heroes. When you step out there, remember you're standing on the shoulders of giants." Her mother, Diane, a small business owner, was a giant in her own right. She'd started a local bakery from scratch, turning a modest storefront into a beloved neighborhood institution. Zara often helped in the shop as a teenager, watching her mother rise before dawn, tirelessly kneading dough, managing orders, and serving customers with a warm smile, even on the days when exhaustion was plain on her face. Diane's hands were calloused and strong, hands that spoke of sacrifice and strength. To Zara, her mother was a living testament to what hard work and persistence could achieve. In high school, Zara began to understand the complexities her parents had navigated to give her the opportunities they'd never had. She noticed how other parents at her predominantly white school treated Diane and Marlon with a mix of polite curiosity and thinly veiled condescension, as if their accomplishments were somehow an anomaly. These encounters, though subtle, stung Zara. She'd watch her father nod and smile through uncomfortable conversations, and see her mother's back straighten whenever someone asked how someone like her managed to build a successful business. It was a steady reminder that no matter how successful they were, some people would always see her family through a narrow lens. Zara's ambition took root early, fed by these experiences and fueled by her parents' encouragement. She worked tirelessly in school, excelling academically and immersing herself in extracurriculars. Her dream was to break into the corporate world and climb the ranks in an industry that often seemed exclusive and insular. Business school was her first major leap towards that goal, and she attacked it with the same determination her mother put into her bakery. In college, Zara formed a close-knit group of friends who shared her aspirations. Among them was Mia, a bold, outspoken young woman with an infectious laugh and a knack for diffusing tension with humor. Zara and Mia bonded over shared dreams and frustrations, spending late nights studying in the library, exchanging stories of their families, and speculating about their future. Mia became Zara's confidant, the friend who always knew how to ground her when her ambitions felt like a burden. "Remember," Mia would say with a mischievous grin, "we're going to take over the world one day, Z, and we'll do it looking good." But even as she moved forward, Zara couldn't escape the systemic challenges she faced. Her first job was at a small financial consulting firm where she was eager to prove herself. Zara's talent was undeniable, and she quickly became known for her analytical skills and dedication. Yet, despite her contributions, she watched as her ideas were either overlooked or credited to others. She noticed how her colleagues, most of whom came from more privileged backgrounds, effortlessly mingled with higher-ups in a way that felt inaccessible to her. There were dinners and gatherings she wasn't invited to, connections she couldn't tap into. Slowly, the realization dawned on her that her hard work alone might not be enough. One incident, in particular, stayed with her. During a team meeting, Zara had proposed a detailed plan for improving client engagement, a proposal she'd worked on for weeks. She was nervous as she presented it, her heart pounding, but she pushed through, hoping her passion would shine through. Her supervisor nodded along, offering little reaction, before moving on to the next topic. A week later, she heard her proposal being praised in another meeting, but this time it was being attributed to a more senior male colleague. When she attempted to speak up, she was met with a dismissive smile. "Great minds think alike," her supervisor had said, brushing her off with a casual wave. It was a familiar pattern, one that continued throughout her early career. Zara began to realize that her struggle wasn't just about proving herself. It was about breaking into spaces that weren't built with her in mind. While her colleagues seemed to move forward with ease, Zara felt like she was constantly pushing against an invisible wall, a barrier defined by her race and gender. The exhaustion from trying to prove herself, only to see her efforts marginalized, began to wear on her. Outside of work, Zara grappled with feelings of inadequacy that she tried to keep from her parents. She didn't want them to know the extent of her struggles, fearing it would disappoint them. Her family's legacy was one of strength and resilience, but there were moments when Zara questioned whether she was capable of living up to it. Yet, even in her darkest moments, she couldn't ignore the fire that burned within her. She was determined to prove that she belonged in the corporate world, not just for herself, but for the countless young black women who would follow in her footsteps. She wanted to be a symbol of possibility, a reminder that the obstacles her family had faced didn't have to define her future. As Zara continued to climb the corporate ladder, her ambition grew alongside a desire to reconnect with her heritage in a way she hadn't explored before. She began to ask her father more questions about their family history, listening to the stories that had once seemed like fairy tales, but now felt essential to understanding her place in the world. She learned about her great-grandmother, a woman who had run a successful laundry business at a time when black-owned businesses were rare and often targeted. She heard about her great-great-grandfather, who had fought for fair wages and equal treatment, organizing his fellow workers despite the dangers. These stories resonated with Zara, connecting her to a lineage of entrepreneurship and resilience that had survived through generations. The weight of this legacy was daunting, but it also filled her with pride. She began to see her journey as a continuation of her ancestors' struggles, a path they had cleared for her in ways both seen and unseen. Still, Zara struggled to fully reconcile her career aspirations with her heritage. In many ways, her corporate ambitions felt at odds with the community-oriented values her parents had instilled in her. She wanted to make her family proud, to honor their sacrifices, but she also wanted to carve out her own path, one that would leave a legacy of her own making. The tension between these desires often left her feeling isolated, as if she was straddling two worlds without fully belonging to either. Her relationship with Mia became a lifeline during these times. Mia understood Zara's drive, her frustrations, and her fears in a way few others could. They shared late-night phone calls, discussing their dreams and disappointments, supporting each other through each setback. Mia's unwavering belief in Zara was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone, even when the journey felt impossibly challenging. "Z, you're not just doing this for yourself," Mia would say, her voice filled with conviction. "You're carrying something bigger, something that matters." These words stuck with Zara, reminding her of her purpose whenever doubt crept in. She knew her journey wasn't just about personal success. It was about reshaping the spaces that had long been closed off to people like her. Each challenge, each barrier, felt like a test of her resolve, a call to push harder and dig deeper. The morning of her interview at the investment firm felt like a culmination of everything she fought for. As she prepared, Zara thought of her parents, her ancestors, and all the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. She knew the odds, understood the biases she would face, but she was determined to move forward, to create a path where none existed before. The day of the interview felt heavier than Zara anticipated, but as she walked into the imposing lobby of Whitmore Investments, she forced herself to stay calm. The marble floors gleamed under the artificial lights, and the quiet hum of business conversations filled the air, echoing softly against the high ceilings. Zara adjusted her suit, taking in the opulence of the surroundings, a world she was on the verge of entering, but one that still felt miles away. As she approached the front desk, a young receptionist greeted her with a professional, if somewhat detached, smile. "Good morning, Ms. Washington," she said, glancing down at her computer. "You're here for the 10 o'clock with Mr. Bradford and the panel, correct?" "Yes," Zara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Her confidence was usually unshakable, but today it felt slightly frayed, as though one wrong move could unravel the entire fabric of her poise. The receptionist nodded, instructing Zara to take a seat while they prepared the conference room. Zara took a deep breath, settling into one of the leather chairs in the waiting area. She took in the pristine modern decor, the rows of sleek furniture, and the monochrome artwork lining the walls. But as she glanced around, her gaze fell upon an old, incongruent portrait that immediately stood out from the otherwise uniform surroundings. The portrait was tucked away on a wall just around the corner, almost as though someone had tried to hide it, yet hadn't quite managed to remove it entirely. The muted colors contrasted sharply with the rest of the room's polished, minimalist aesthetic. Zara's curiosity piqued as she studied the painting more closely. It depicted a woman with skin the color of mahogany, her dark, wavy hair swept up and styled in a manner that suggested a time long past. The woman was dressed in formal attire, her blouse buttoned high at the collar, her posture erect and dignified. Her gaze was direct, almost defiant, as though daring anyone to look away. There was something in her expression, an intensity that made Zara feel as though she was being seen, judged, even challenged. The nameplate beneath the portrait was barely legible, worn with age, but Zara could just make out the faint lettering, Lillian Harper. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the painting, a sensation that sent a shiver down her spine. Who was Lillian Harper? And why was her portrait so out of place in this otherwise meticulously curated environment? Before she could contemplate further, a young man approached her. "Ms. Washington, they're ready for you." Zara tore her gaze from the painting and nodded, adjusting her posture. She followed him down a long hallway and into a spacious conference room where the interview panel waited. The tension in the air was immediate. There were 4 people seated across from her, each with an expression that seemed to range from indifference to barely disguised skepticism. "Good morning, Ms. Washington," greeted Mr. Bradford, a senior executive in his mid-50s with silver hair and a piercing gaze. He gave her a cursory glance before looking down at his tablet, an action that seemed both dismissive and routine. Next to him sat a younger woman with an unreadable expression and 2 men who seemed entirely uninterested in her presence. "Let's begin," Mr. Bradford said, launching into a series of questions that seemed more designed to test her resilience than to evaluate her qualifications. As the minutes passed, Zara felt the subtle sting of condescension in their voices. They scrutinized her resume, probing her past experiences with a detached coldness that veiled their doubt. The undercurrent was clear. They questioned whether she truly belonged here. It was during one of these pointed questions, as Mr. Bradford asked about a particularly challenging project she'd managed, that her gaze drifted back to the doorway. From this angle, she could see the edge of Lillian Harper's portrait peeking out from around the corner, as if the woman herself were standing just out of sight, observing the proceedings. Unable to resist, Zara gestured toward the hallway. "I noticed the portrait outside," she said, interrupting the conversation. The woman, Lillian Harper. Who was she? For the first time, the panel seemed genuinely caught off guard. Mr. Bradford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking toward the door before returning to Zara. The younger woman glanced at the others as if searching for an appropriate response, while the 2 men merely exchanged looks of mild surprise. "Oh," Mr. Bradford said after a pause, his voice carrying a dismissive tone. "That's an old relic from the firm's early days. Ms. Harper was involved with the company when it was first established, but it's ancient history. She's not particularly relevant to what we do here today." Zara couldn't ignore the casual way he dismissed the subject. There was a strange discomfort in his tone, a slight edge that piqued her curiosity further. She was used to people dismissing things, including herself, but this felt different. Why would they display her portrait at all if she wasn't important? And why was it nearly hidden? She pressed on, ignoring the uncomfortable looks from the panel. So she was a founder or early investor? Something along those lines. One of the other men said with a shrug. "It's not particularly important now. Times have changed, and so has Whitmore Investments." An awkward silence filled the room. Zara felt the tension thickening, but she knew she couldn't risk pushing further without jeopardizing her chances at the job. So she nodded, feigning acceptance, and the interview continued, though her focus had shifted. As she walked out of the building, her mind lingered on the portrait. The encounter had left her feeling unsettled, as though she just glimpsed something that was meant to stay hidden. Once outside, She glanced back over her shoulder, hoping to catch a final glimpse of the mysterious woman's portrait. The nagging feeling that there was more to the story gnawed at her, pulling at her curiosity. Zara took out her phone, snapped a quick photo of the portrait, and began her walk to the subway. She'd barely taken 2 steps before she was already searching for the name Lillian Harper online. The information was sparse, unusually so, for someone connected to such a prominent firm. A few brief mentions in outdated documents, no images, no extensive records. It was as if she had been erased, relegated to a footnote in the company's history. A chill ran down Zara's spine. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Lillian Harper? Why was her story buried? And why did her portrait seem to carry such weight, such defiance, as though she had something to say even from beyond the grave? That night, Zara poured herself a cup of coffee and delved into her research, determined to uncover the truth. She combed through obscure databases, old business directories, and archives, piecing together what little information she could find. What she discovered was intriguing but incomplete. Lillian Harper had indeed been involved in the firm's inception in the early 1920s, a black woman at the heart of an elite investment firm, a rare and revolutionary feat for the time. But there was more, or rather, there was something missing. Records from that era hinted at her being a formidable figure, one whose business acumen was respected by even her most established male peers. Yet, shortly after the company's initial success, her presence faded from the documents, leaving only faint traces and vague mentions. Zara's mind spun with possibilities. Could it be that Lillian Harper had been forced out of her own company? Had her achievements been intentionally erased? The implications unsettled her deeply, but they also fueled a growing sense of resolve. Lillian Harper's story deserved to be told, and perhaps, in some way, uncovering it would help Zara find her own path forward in a world that often tried to dismiss women like her. As she closed her laptop, her eyes drifting to the photograph of Lillian's portrait on her phone, Zara felt a newfound determination. This wasn't just a story about an obscure figure from the past. It was a legacy that had been denied, a history that demanded acknowledgement. The questions that swirled in her mind were no longer just curiosities. They were a call to action, a mystery that she felt compelled to unravel. The days following the interview were a blur for Zara, but one thing remained clear in her mind: Lillian Harper. The image of the woman's stern, defiant gaze haunted her thoughts. Each time she closed her eyes, Zara could see that portrait, almost as if Lillian were calling out to her, urging her to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath the layers of time. Driven by curiosity, Zara decided to start with the basics. She returned to Whitmore Investments, ostensibly to thank the panel and inquire about the position, but her real purpose lay in sneaking another look at the portrait. This time, she studied it with a sharper eye, noticing subtle details she hadn't picked up on before. The slight crease at the edge of Lillian's brow, as though she were bearing the weight of something significant, her posture unyielding but weary, as if she'd been standing her ground for too long. Leaving the building, Zara felt more determined than ever. She started researching Lillian Harper, expecting to find more information online now that she had a firmer direction. But her search results were disappointingly thin. Apart from the same few vague mentions she'd come across before, Lillian was practically a ghost. There were no public archives detailing her life, no family members listed, not even an obituary. Why would someone go through so much trouble to erase her? Zara murmured to herself. The mystery gnawed at her, deepening her resolve. The next day, Zara decided to visit the local library. She explained her research to a librarian who seemed delighted by her interest in local history. The librarian led her to the microfilm archives, offering some tips on navigating the old records and wishing her luck. For hours, Zara sifted through the reels, the whirring of the microfilm machine becoming a steady rhythm in her mind. She scanned newspaper articles, business directories, society pages, anything that might offer a glimpse into Lillian's life. The labor was tedious, but as the hours passed, Zara found herself sinking deeper into the mystery, her frustration only fueling her curiosity. Finally, her patience was rewarded. In an issue of the Boston Sentinel from the summer of 1923, Zara came across a small article announcing Whitmore Investments' grand opening. Her heart skipped a beat as she scanned the list of founding members, and there it was, Lillian Harper, partner. Partner, Zara whispered, savoring the word. This wasn't just some token role, as the interview panel had implied. Lillian had been a founding partner, a title that carried weight, authority, and influence, especially in an era when Black women had almost no access to such positions. It felt like discovering a hidden treasure, one that had been buried for almost a century. Continuing her search, Zara found a short profile of Lillian in a business magazine from later that year. The article was brief but filled with praise, describing Lillian as a formidable mind in finance and a rare visionary. But just as quickly as she'd appeared, she seemed to vanish. By 1925, there were no further mentions of her, as if she disappeared without a trace. As Zara closed the reel, her mind raced with questions. If Lillian had been such a crucial part of Whitmore Investments' early success, why was she so obscured in their history? Why had the firm's executives been so dismissive of her role? She needed to dig deeper. Over the next few days, Zara's research led her to the Boston Historical Society, hoping they might have more substantial records. She spent hours in the archive room, carefully thumbing through documents, checking every possible lead. Late one evening, just as she was considering calling it a day, she stumbled upon a breakthrough, a financial report from Whitmore Investments in 1924, where Lillian's name was prominently listed among the top partners. But even more intriguing was a small handwritten note in the margin. Dispute with partners. Status to be reconsidered. Zara frowned, her mind spinning. A dispute? The note was cryptic, giving no details, but it suggested that something had happened. Something serious enough to threaten Lillian's position at the firm. She imagined the boardroom scene, a lone Black woman standing against a room full of white men, perhaps fighting for her rightful place, challenging their authority. Intrigued, Zara returned to the microfilm archives, scanning every available record from 1924 onwards. Finally, she found what she was looking for. Buried deep in the society pages of the Boston Evening Standard, there was a brief article hinting at a sudden shakeup at Whitmore Investments. The piece mentioned only that Ms. Lillian Harper has stepped down as partner, with no reason given. The tone was vague, even dismissive, and the rest of the article shifted focus to Whitmore's male partners. Zara's stomach twisted. "Step down," she muttered. It sounded too much like a cover-up, a convenient way to erase someone who had dared to challenge the status quo. The implications settled heavily on her. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had been pushed aside, whose contributions had been minimized, possibly even intentionally erased. Lillian Harper wasn't just a forgotten figure. She was someone whose story had been deliberately obscured. Back in her apartment that night, Zara's thoughts raced. The more she uncovered, the more she felt an eerie kinship with Lillian. They both wanted to break through boundaries, to prove they belonged in spaces that seemed off-limits. And yet, Lillian's fate was a grim reminder of what could happen when someone pushed too hard against the established order. As Zara sat with these thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was her mother, checking in on her. She almost ignored it, but decided to answer. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, baby. How was the interview?" Her mother's voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of her own struggles as a Black woman in the corporate world. Zara hesitated, not wanting to tell her the full story just yet. "It was interesting," she replied. "Actually, I'm looking into someone who worked there a long time ago. Her name was Lillian Harper." Her mother was silent for a moment. Lillian Harper. That name sounds familiar. Zara sat up. "You've heard of her?" "I'm not sure, but I remember your grandma mentioning a Harper family. They were well respected, owned a few businesses back in the day. Maybe there's a connection." Zara's heart raced. Could her own family history be intertwined with Lillian's? It was a tantalizing possibility, and she knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she'd uncovered the truth. The following day, Zara reached out to the few elderly members of her extended family who might remember more. Her great-aunt Martha, a spry 85-year-old, was thrilled to hear from her, and even more excited to share what she knew. "Oh, honey, the Harpers were legends in their own right. Aunt Martha said, her voice crackling over the phone. Lillian was something of a local celebrity back then. People used to say she was as sharp as a tack and twice as determined. But she vanished. Just disappeared one day, and nobody ever knew why. Do you know if she had family? Zara asked, hanging on every word. I think she had a sister, Martha mused. Not sure what happened to her, though. But Zara, if you're looking into Lillian, you'd better be prepared. People tried to forget her, but you know how our people are. We don't forget so easily. After the call, Zara sat in silence, processing the flood of new information. Lillian wasn't just an obscure figure. She was a legend in her community. Her impact had been profound, even if her story had been suppressed. A small but fiery determination ignited within Zara. She had to find out more, not just for herself, but to honor the legacy of a woman who had been unjustly silenced. As the days went by, Zara's discoveries continued to mount, each piece of the puzzle leading her further down a path she felt destined to follow. She found a photograph of Lillian, a candid shot from a gala event in 1923. In the image, Lillian was caught mid-laugh, her eyes alive with a spark that Zara recognized instantly. It was the same spark she saw in her own reflection each morning, a fierce determination to prove herself, to leave a mark that would not be erased. With each small discovery, Zara felt Lillian's presence growing stronger, as though her spirit were guiding her toward something bigger. Lillian's struggle, her ambition, her erasure, all of it resonated deeply, and Zara knew she couldn't stop now. She had uncovered just enough to see the outline of a much larger story, one that spoke to resilience, defiance, and the fierce will of those who refused to be forgotten. The following week, Zara's hunt for answers became more intense and more obstructed. Her request to access Whitmore Investments' full archives was promptly denied. The archivist, a middle-aged woman with a suspicious squint, claimed the files from the early years of the company were classified due to company policy on sensitive historical documents. Classified? Zara repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. But I'm just looking for information on a founding partner. I don't need sensitive data. The archivist's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Washington, these records are restricted for a reason. Perhaps it's best to focus on what's available in the public records. Zara's frustration flared, but she sensed that pressing further here would only create more resistance. She took a breath, forced a polite smile, and left the office, her mind racing. The company's reluctance felt almost like an admission of guilt. Why would they deny her access to records about someone from nearly a century ago, unless there was something they didn't want her to find? Leaving the firm, she began feeling the weight of isolation. At home, her family grew increasingly concerned. One night, after an exhausting day at work, Zara called her mother, hoping for support but receiving unexpected pushback instead. Zara, honey, I know you're determined, her mother said gently, but don't you think it might be time to let this go? You're putting so much energy into a story no one else seems to care about. Mom, it's not just a story, Zara replied, her voice tinged with frustration. This is about giving someone their due. Lillian Harper was erased, buried by the very institution she helped build. Doesn't that matter? It does, but baby, who's this really for? Is it for her or for you? Her mother's voice was soft, but the question cut deep. For a moment, doubt crept into Zara's mind. Was she truly doing this to honor Lillian, or was this quest about proving something to herself? She shook off the thought, unwilling to entertain it. She believed in what she was doing, even if no one else did. But the doubt lingered, resurfacing at inconvenient moments, like the next day when her boss pulled her aside at work. You've been distracted lately, Zara, her boss said bluntly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Your focus is slipping. We need you here, not lost in some pet project. Zara bit back a retort, swallowing her frustration. I understand, she replied, forcing herself to sound apologetic, even though resentment simmered beneath her calm exterior. She couldn't explain her investigation to him. It was too personal, too complex. He wouldn't understand the drive that propelled her, the feeling that each step she took honored her own history as much as Lillian's. That evening, Zara returned to Whitmore for one last attempt. She lingered in the lobby, her eyes scanning the building with a renewed intensity. There had to be someone, anyone, who could offer her more information. As she waited, she noticed an elderly janitor sweeping near the lobby doors. His face was lined with age, but his gaze was sharp and discerning. Zara watched him for a moment before deciding to approach. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "I'm looking into the history of this company, particularly about a woman named Lillian Harper. Do you happen to know anything about her?" The janitor paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Lillian Harper, you say? Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long, long time." He set down his broom, gesturing for her to follow him toward a quieter corner. "Why do you ask about her?" Zara hesitated. I think she deserves recognition. I found out she was a founding partner, but there's almost no record of her." The janitor chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to hold a mix of admiration and sorrow. "You're right about that. Lillian Harper was something else, all right. Not many like her back then, or now, for that matter. So, why isn't there more about her?" Zara pressed, her curiosity mounting. The janitor glanced around before leaning closer. They didn't want anyone to remember her. The folks in charge back then, they didn't like the idea of a black woman having that much influence. She didn't just make money, she made enemies. Some folks didn't think she deserved to be there at all, let alone be remembered. Zara's heart raced. "You're saying they buried her legacy on purpose?" He nodded slowly, his gaze turning distant as if recalling long-buried memories. Whitmore's later leaders wanted to wipe her name clean off the firm's history. They started erasing her the moment she was gone, piece by piece, until all that was left was that portrait, just enough to remind folks she'd been there without letting anyone dig too deep. "Why leave the portrait at all, then?" Zara asked. The janitor shrugged. "Maybe they thought it'd satisfy people. A token gesture, like throwing a bone. But you're right. There's a story there, and it's worth telling. Just be careful. A lot of folks don't want that story to come out, even now." Zara's determination flared anew, overriding her earlier doubts. She was no longer just curious, she was resolute. This was about honoring Lillian's contributions, restoring her rightful place in history. And if anyone tried to stop her, she would be ready. Fueled by the janitor's cryptic words, Zara returned home with a renewed fire. Over the next week, she delved even deeper into her research, contacting historians, scouring online databases, and even cold-calling relatives of former Whitmore employees. But each lead seemed to hit a dead end, as if an invisible wall had been constructed around Lillian's story. One night, while poring over her notes, she received an email from an anonymous account with the subject line, "Re Lillian Harper." Her pulse quickened as she opened it. "If you're looking for the truth, you're closer than you think. Look to the land deal records for Whitmore's early properties. Lillian's role was more than just symbolic. She secured assets that kept the firm afloat during the Depression. But when the recession hit, they turned on her. They didn't want to give her credit for what she'd done, so they buried her contributions." The email ended with an unsigned note. Her story deserves to be told. This was the twist Zara needed. The land deals. If Lillian had secured those properties, it meant she had kept the company alive during one of the most difficult periods in American history. She wasn't just a partner. She'd been the backbone, a silent hero who'd stabilized the firm through a national crisis. But Zara's renewed efforts hit another setback when she learned that many of Whitmore's land deal records from the Depression era had mysteriously disappeared from official archives. She felt the walls closing in again, as if someone were deliberately thwarting her efforts. Each roadblock only made her more determined to uncover the truth, but the weight of secrecy bore down on her, and the resistance felt more oppressive than ever. She sat at her desk that night, her frustration boiling over. Was it even possible to break through these layers of secrecy? She couldn't shake her mother's earlier question, "Is this for her or for you?" Zara took a long, shuddering breath, realizing that her quest wasn't just about uncovering Lillian's story. It was also about her own journey, the struggle to reclaim her sense of purpose, to stand tall in a world that tried to dismiss her worth. Lillian's fight was hers, and that connection was what made her resolve even stronger. The final piece fell into place when she returned to Whitmore one last time. The janitor caught her eye as she walked past him in the lobby. With a knowing nod, he slipped a folded piece of paper into her hand, and she felt a rush of gratitude for this unlikely ally. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Go get him, kid," he replied, a glint of encouragement in his eyes. Back in her car, Zara unfolded the paper and gasped. It was a keycard for the restricted archive room she'd been denied access to earlier. The janitor had given her a way in. Now, at last, she had the means to find the missing pieces of Lillian's story, to confront the firm's hidden legacy head-on. Her heart pounded as she realized that she was on the brink of discovering the truth, of redeeming a forgotten legacy that had been buried too long. She would tell Lillian's story, even if it meant challenging the powers that had silenced her. Her journey was far from over, but Zara knew, without a doubt, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Late at night, Zara sat alone in the archive room, her fingers trembling as she sifted through a yellowed, leather-bound journal. She had spent hours digging through old documents, ledgers, and correspondence files in search of anything that could reveal Lillian Harper's story. And now, in her hands, was a diary, its faded script carefully preserved yet nearly obscured by time. The cover bore Lillian's initials, and as Zara opened it, the words on the first page took her breath away. "To the future woman who finds this, I hope you are braver than I." A rush of emotions surged through Zara. She'd been so focused on finding hard evidence, on piecing together Lillian's legacy through numbers and deals, that she hadn't imagined finding something so personal. She gently turned the pages, taking in each entry as though it were a conversation between them, between two women separated by decades yet bound by shared struggles and dreams. The entries varied from short, rushed notes to long, deeply reflective passages. Some pages had doodles, little sketches of the skyline, as seen from Lillian's office window or flowers in the margins. But the words painted a clearer picture than anything Zara could have anticipated. In one entry, Lillian described the thrill of her first stock market win, a deal she closed single-handedly that had saved Whitmore from potential bankruptcy during the early days of the Depression. Her writing was sharp, astute, brimming with the excitement of a woman who knew her worth even if others didn't. Zara could almost see her, a young, sharp-eyed businesswoman in a sea of doubters, proving them wrong with every calculated risk and victory. But as she read on, the tone shifted. Lillian's pride began to give way to a bittersweet frustration as she recounted how her accomplishments were minimized, how her name was often left off reports and memos even though her work was central to the firm's success. "They thank me when they need me," one entry read, "and when the crisis has passed, they forget I was here at all. My name is hidden beneath theirs, my ideas passed off as theirs, and yet they keep me on only because they know they need me." Zara's heart clenched. She knew all too well the sting of working hard, only to see others take credit. It was the feeling of being indispensable yet invisible, of knowing your worth but watching others deny it. Then, Zara came upon a series of entries from what appeared to be the height of Lillian's career. She detailed a groundbreaking investment strategy she'd developed, a diversification model that would go on to become Whitmore's foundation. She had structured it to protect the firm from another potential economic collapse, making Whitmore the resilient powerhouse it was today. But no credit had ever been given to her, nor had any mention of her involvement remained in the firm's official history. One particular entry seemed to sum up Lillian's silent endurance. "I could leave, but they'd erase me faster than I could pack my bags. So I stay, not because they value me, but because I value what I have built here. Perhaps one day another woman will read these words and know that I did not let them break me." Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Lillian's pain and persistence. She could imagine Lillian's struggle, the relentless pushback, the subtle slights, and the constant need to prove herself. This wasn't just a story of an erased legacy. It was a portrait of resilience, of a woman who had carved out her place in history despite a world designed to overlook her. Lillian's entries became more desperate in the later pages. She described secret meetings, hostile boardroom exchanges, and the strategic moves she was forced to make just to maintain her position. Zara's pulse quickened as she read an entry that revealed the depth of Lillian's betrayal. They brought me in to save them, and now they plan to cut me loose. After everything, they call it a business decision. I know what this is. They cannot stand the thought of me at their table, my name beside theirs. They'll take my ideas and leave me with nothing. The final entries chronicled her final days at the firm. Lillian had been pushed out after orchestrating a major victory for Whitmore, a stock market deal that had turned the firm's fortune around. Instead of being celebrated, she had been summoned to a private meeting where her contract was revised. In her words, the meeting felt like being disarmed in battle, betrayed by allies you thought you could trust. The men she had helped had shown her the door, claiming it was for the firm's long-term vision. Zara's eyes stung as she continued reading, her heart pounding with anger and sorrow. The words captured a betrayal so deep that it left her speechless. She understood now that Lillian hadn't just been removed from Whitmore. She had been deliberately erased. Her contributions were hidden, her name omitted, her legacy buried. In the final entry, dated just before she left Whitmore for good, Lillian had written a note of defiance. They think they've taken my legacy, but a legacy is not theirs to take. It lives in the work, in the foundations I built. One day, someone will tell my story. Zara sat back, overcome by a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her. She felt a kinship with Lillian that transcended time. Lillian's words resonated with her own struggle, her own frustrations with a system that still tried to limit her, to stifle her contributions and keep her silent. She felt Lillian's story sear into her, as if it were igniting a fire that had been smoldering within her all along. For a moment, Zara allowed herself to grieve for Lillian, to feel the injustice of her erasure. But as she closed the diary, grief transformed into determination. Lillian had been forced into silence, but Zara had a voice she could use to amplify Lillian's story. The emotions swirled within her: anger, sorrow, admiration, and pride. She realized that her journey was no longer just about her own ambitions. It was about honoring Lillian and all the women like her who had been marginalized, who had sacrificed so much only to be forgotten. Taking a deep breath, she whispered into the empty room, "I'll tell your story, Lillian. I promise." Zara felt a sense of peace settle over her, as though Lillian's spirit lingered, nodding in approval. She left the archives that night with a renewed purpose. The world would know Lillian's name, and her legacy would be restored. Zara would make sure of it, even if it meant challenging Whitmore from the inside, risking her own career, and shattering the firm's polished image. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, Zara began drafting an article, a meticulous, emotional account of Lillian Harper's contributions and the systemic betrayal she had endured. She would send it to every major business magazine, every journalist she could contact. She would tell the world what she had uncovered, and she would not stop until Lillian's name was known. The depth of her connection to Lillian became her fuel. The pain Lillian had endured, the perseverance she had shown despite unimaginable odds. These were things Zara could relate to on a visceral level. This was no longer just a personal journey but a mission. She was not only reclaiming Lillian's place in history, she was asserting her own right to take up space, to be seen and heard. As Zara's fingers flew over the keyboard, crafting the narrative of Lillian's life and achievements, she felt an intense, almost sacred purpose guiding her. She was honoring her own history, her own potential. She was breaking barriers that Lillian had once faced alone. By morning, she had crafted an expose that would shake the foundations of Whitmore. It was powerful, raw, and fiercely honest. Zara titled it simply, "The Woman Who Built Whitmore." The morning light streamed through the tall glass windows of Whitmore Investment Firm, casting a warm glow across the polished conference table where Zara now stood, confident and resolute. This wasn't the job interview she had envisioned weeks ago. Today, she was no longer just a hopeful applicant, but an empowered investor determined to make a change. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense, with the executive's eyes narrowing in disbelief as Zara prepared to deliver her presentation. Zara glanced around the room, noting the familiar faces of the panel who had once dismissed her talent and potential. The senior executive, who had questioned her qualifications with barely veiled condescension, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She felt a rush of adrenaline at the thought of standing up to them. She had spent the last few weeks meticulously researching, gathering evidence, and preparing for this moment, not only for herself but for Lillian Harper, the woman whose legacy had been stolen and hidden. With a deep breath, Zara began, "Thank you all for being here today. I'm here to discuss something far more important than my previous application. I want to talk about the legacy of Lillian Harper, a woman whose contributions have shaped the very foundation of this firm." She clicked to her first slide, which displayed the portrait of Lillian, a striking image of a confident black woman with an unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through time. Zara's heart swelled with pride as she continued. Lillian Harper was not just a founding partner of Whitmore. She was a visionary, a pioneer in an industry dominated by men, and her story deserves to be told. The murmurs began, hesitant exchanges and incredulous glances. Zara could feel the weight of their skepticism, but she pressed on, her voice steady and passionate. She outlined her findings, sharing the diary entries she had discovered, the newspaper articles that documented Lillian's triumphs, and the systemic erasure of her contributions. She spoke of Lillian's innovations, the groundbreaking investment strategies that had saved the firm during the Great Depression, and the boardroom battles she had fought against those who sought to diminish her legacy. As she presented, she could see a flicker of understanding in the board members' eyes, especially when she described Lillian's final moments at Whitmore, betrayed yet unbroken. "We cannot allow this story to be forgotten," Zara emphasized, her tone rising with conviction. "Lillian fought for her place in history, and we owe it to her, and to all the women who have come after her, to honor her memory." After the presentation, the board remained silent, their expressions a mix of admiration and disbelief. Zara had expected resistance, but the urgency in her voice and the weight of her evidence were undeniable. Finally, the chair of the board spoke, "Zara, we appreciate your passion and the work you've done. However, this is an established firm with a long history. Introducing Lillian's legacy may be challenging." Zara wasn't deterred. Challenging? Yes, but necessary. You have a unique opportunity to make a meaningful change in the culture of this company. You can lead the way in acknowledging the contributions of women and people of color in our history. It's not just about Lillian. It's about setting a precedent for transparency and inclusivity. One of the board members cleared his throat, clearly impressed despite his initial resistance. "What exactly do you propose, Zara?" "I propose that we unveil Lillian's portrait in a lobby as a symbol of her contributions, that we establish a scholarship fund for women in finance, and that her story be incorporated into the firm's history lessons for new hires. This isn't just about rewriting the past. It's about shaping a better future." The room fell silent again, but this time the tension felt different. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a recognition that perhaps Zara's vision was one they could align with. After a lengthy discussion, they agreed to her proposals, reluctantly at first. But Zara could see the change in their attitudes. They realized the potential for Whitmore to lead by example in an industry often criticized for its lack of diversity and representation. As she left the boardroom, Zara felt a rush of exhilaration mixed with disbelief. She had done it. She had fought not only for her own place in this world, but for Lillian Harper and for countless others who had been silenced. The weight of her ancestors' struggles and her own challenges seemed lighter now, as though she had finally found her footing. Weeks later, Zara stood in the firm's lobby, surrounded by colleagues and members of the press. Today was the unveiling of Lillian Harper's portrait, an event that had become a landmark moment for Whitmore. As the curtain fell away, revealing Lillian's dignified image, a wave of applause erupted. Zara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched her story come alive in front of those who had once overlooked her. "Today, we honor Lillian Harper," Zara began, stepping up to the podium. "A woman who built this firm with her vision, her intellect, and her unwavering resilience. Her story is not just a part of our history. It is a part of who we are today and who we aspire to be tomorrow." She recounted Lillian's achievements, her struggles, and the triumphs that had been obscured for so long. Zara spoke with fervor, inspiring her colleagues to reflect on their roles in creating an inclusive environment where stories like Lillian's would never be forgotten again. She encouraged them to be advocates for change, not only within the firm, but in the industry at large. After her speech, Zara stepped away from the podium, her heart swelling with pride as she felt the weight of history being lifted. The portrait stood tall, a testament to the journey of a remarkable woman, and Zara knew in that moment that Lillian's legacy would inspire generations to come. In the following months, Zara worked tirelessly to implement the scholarship fund, organizing mentorship programs for young women in finance, and ensuring that Lillian's story became an integral part of the firm's culture. The changes were met with a mix of enthusiasm and challenges, but Zara faced each obstacle head-on, fueled by the knowledge that she was honoring a legacy that was too important to remain buried. Zara continued to write, documenting her journey and Lillian's story in a blog that gained traction among aspiring professionals. Her words resonated with many who felt overlooked, igniting conversations about representation, resilience, and the importance of acknowledging historical contributions. She began receiving messages from women across the country, sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph, each one echoing the sentiments of Lillian's experiences. One particularly touching message came from a young woman named Mia, who wrote about her aspirations to enter finance, but felt discouraged by the lack of representation in the field. "Your work has inspired me to keep pushing forward," Mia wrote. "Thank you for bringing Lillian's story to light. It reminds me that I, too, can make a difference." Zara felt a swell of pride at these words. She had created a ripple effect, one that would continue to inspire and empower others. She realized that this was the legacy she had hoped for, not just for Lillian, but for herself and for every woman who dared to dream. On a chilly autumn day, as Zara walked past Lillian's portrait on her way to a meeting, she paused, a sense of connection washing over her. The portrait captured Lillian's strength, her determination, and her spirit. In that moment, Zara felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Lillian," she whispered, feeling the weight of their shared history. "You've taught me so much about resilience and the importance of remembering those who came before us." As the seasons changed and the firm continued to grow and evolve, Zara understood that her journey was far from over. There were still many stories waiting to be uncovered, many voices yearning to be heard. She resolved to keep pushing forward, honoring Lillian's legacy by ensuring that all stories would be told, that all contributions would be recognized, and that the path would be clearer for those who followed. In the years to come, as Zara climbed the corporate ladder, she would carry Lillian's story with her, sharing it in every meeting, in every discussion about diversity and inclusion. She would advocate for those who felt unseen, just as Lillian had fought for her rightful place in a world that sought to erase her. And as she stood before her colleagues, sharing her experiences and urging them to honor the past, Zara understood that she was not only forging her path, but also creating a legacy of strength and resilience that would transcend time. It was a legacy that honored Lillian Harper, a woman who had once been silenced, but whose spirit now thrived in the hearts of those who dared to dream. The final image of the portrait hung in the lobby of Whitmore, a reminder that every story matters, that every contribution counts, and that the past is a powerful force shaping the future. As Zara looked at Lillian's image one last time, she felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. They had both found their voices, and together, they would inspire change for generations to come.